when I lectured professionally in tax, I always started with a slide that said disclaimer, because you spend your entire life in professional services worried about being sued. But I can't really think about how I might get sued for what I'm going to talk about tonight. But there are some preliminary points I want to make. I have no formal Islamic qualifications, but I have been studying Islam quite seriously and doing a lot of reading since 2002 when I went on the Hajj. Before that, I didn't really used to bother. I've assumed that you have no knowledge about Islam, and that could be unfair to some of the people in the room, but it makes it easier to construct the presentation because, of course, you then start from a common base of 0 and build upwards from there. And my treatment about religious freedom is theological rather than historical. I could have talked about how Europe used to treat religious minorities, both European Christian heretics and Jews, contrast them with how Muslims treated religious minorities, but I've chosen not to do that. I might mention it in passing or something, but I want to talk about theology and religious belief. And these are my views. With 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, there are lots of different views about religion. I can guarantee that what I'm going to say would be totally contradicted by everybody in ISIS, for example. But as far as I'm concerned, they're wrong. Picture of me. It's the first picture I've liked for 6 years, so I've recently... One of the things I do on my website is I publish success tips, and one of my success tips aimed at young people primarily is to get yourself a really good quality picture and then use it everywhere, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. But the key point on this slide is actually in red. It's the address of my website, where a lot of the things that I've written in the past about religion, as well as other issues like politics and economics and the Euro crisis, end up. And I'm hoping, I'm recording this presentation. If the sound quality works out okay, I'm planning to put a self-advancing PowerPoint presentation on my website eventually. But if anybody wants the slides, Charlotte's got them, Josh has got them, and they're free to share them around. There's nothing on the slides which is confidential copy. Well, it is all copyright, but you're welcome to share it. What am I going to talk about? Fundamentally, I want to, first of all, set the scene about why beliefs really, really matter. A little bit of introduction to Islam itself. And then, because this is a lecture and not a detective story, the plot is revealed straight away afterwards, which is what I believe about religious freedom. And then the rest of the presentation will explain why I believe what I believe and how, as far as I'm concerned, my views on religious freedom are totally grounded in Islam and the Quran itself. Finally, possibly the most useful part of the presentation, the bibliography, because there are some things I want to recommend that people should access if they want to learn more either about Islam or about the subject we're talking about tonight, and then the Q&A. So the question of beliefs. My original education was scientific. I did science A-levels, I did a maths degree. I was always an interest in theoretical physics. And theoretical physics, people do thought experiments. I don't know if anybody here has done a degree in physics, for example, but Maxwell's demon comes to mind as an illustration of a thought experiment. And my thought experiment is actually much simpler. I want you to imagine I've got a watering can. I've got 2 watering cans, and one of them contains water, and I'm going to hose all of this side of the room with the water. Apologies about the clothes. Then the other can actually contains petrol, and this side of the room gets doused in petrol. And then we change the environment, and on one side you've got people who are all up in flames. This side of the room is actually even better than they were neutral. They're better off than they were when they came into the room because I covered them with water, and they are, of course, perfectly safe. So the beliefs that you acquire, and people acquire beliefs from somewhere, either through careful study or through carelessness, make a fundamental difference to how you react to the environment. And here I've got some of the great horrors of the 20th century. The Holocaust, the liquidation of landlords in China, and these happened in times of great political and social stress. Germany, with the disaster of the First World War, the hyperinflation that came afterwards, the Depression, suffered an enormous amount of stress. But underlying that was also a collection of beliefs. The Nazis really believed something with their racial theories. And without those beliefs that Jews were effectively subhuman, no matter what the level of social stress or economic stress, they would not have chosen to start killing Jews. Exactly the same with liquidating the landlords. If you don't believe in Marxism-Leninism, that there's fundamental class conflict, you are far less likely to get involved in liquidating people just because they are rich. And the same with religious extremism with the collapse of Yugoslavia. So beliefs really do matter. Now, just a very short introduction to Islam. Start with the most fundamental source of Islam, which is the Quran. And it's very simple from a Muslim perspective. God effectively passed the Quran to the Archangel Gabriel, who revealed it to the Prophet Muhammad, and the Quran that we have today is the Quran that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. It was revealed in very small parts, starting 610 AD, when Muhammad was 40 years old, the traditional age for prophets to start their activities. Moses was 40, I think, at the time that he killed the Egyptian and fled into Midian. And it carried on being revealed until 632 AD, just a few months before the Prophet, peace be upon him, died. And Muhammad received the Quran in small pieces. He taught it to other people. The first follower of Muhammad was actually his wife, Khadija. And in fact, one of our daughters is called Khadija. It was widely memorized by people. And there was people were also encouraged to write it down. And under the first Caliph Abu Bakr, the Quran was pulled together and recorded, and then fully harmonized under the Caliph Uthman, who ensured that all other variant copies of the Quran were destroyed. And Muslims are convinced that we have a single text that's been unchanged since the time of Caliph Uthman. And the discovery of a Quran fragment in Birmingham University last year, which caused great excitement worldwide, Muslims were really excited by that because it supports the single Quran theory. Obviously, non-Muslims have never accepted that Muhammad received the Quran from God. They're perfectly entitled to believe that. They believe that Muhammad composed it from Jewish and Christian sources from Arabia at that time, but also believe that Muhammad was the person who was involved in the formulation of the Quran, and that these dates are accurate. There is what you would call a revisionist theory dating back to the 1970s from a man called John Wansborough, that the Quran was actually put together from other sources about 150 or 200 years later, which we don't have time to discuss now. But there's a review of John Wansborough's book, Quranic Studies, on my website, explaining why I think Wansborough is just completely wrong. So that regardless of whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, I do believe that the Quran dates back to then. And of course, as a religious Muslim, I believe that Muhammad didn't invent it, he got it from God. Interpreting the Quran. I mean, the Quran is not a very big book. It's much shorter than the Bible, and there are parts of it which are very easy to understand. There are parts which are harder to understand. The most fundamental principle is that it has to be read and understood as a whole. If there's a part of the Quran that you have problems understanding, think of it in the context of a whole, and that quite often clarifies it. And fundamentally, from my perspective, the Quran is telling us what God wanted mankind to do, in particular what he wanted mankind to do at the time that it was revealed, and now. And one of the questions we'll look at later on is whether there's any difference between what he wants us to do now and then, and Muslims differ on this. There are some Muslims who believe that the Quran is like a recipe book. Whatever is written, that you apply without worrying about whether circumstances in any way are different now than they were 1400 years ago. The fact that we're in the United Kingdom rather than in Western Arabia. I don't. And in fact, so the argument that Islam is completely unchangeable, that it has never changed, never will change, there is a single way to be a Muslim, you only need one counterexample to disprove a universal proposition. That's one of the things I learned during my maths degree. One counterexample is enough. And I have one for you. And it's one that you can't argue with because it's so rooted in Islamic history itself. And it relates to the way that the Caliph Umar deviated both from the practice of the Prophet Muhammad, who he knew personally, who he had followed for many years, and deviated from the plain text of the Quran. This is verse 9.60 of the Quran, and it's about the distribution of Zakat. And Zakat is a kind of compulsory charity that you have in Quran. God encourages you to be charitable, but particularly at the time of the Prophet and in Muslim states, Zakat is actually collected. There are rules about how you compute it, which we're not going to go into now, and you have to pay it, just like you have to pay income tax or value-added tax. So Zakat is collected by the Treasury, and there are rules about who can receive it. So here in verse 960 is about who can receive it, who can be given money from the central treasury, from Zakat funds. And one category is those whose hearts are to be won over. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, used to distribute Zakat money to some of the people in Mecca, wealthy aristocrats from Mecca, who had previously been pagans, who had been opponents, who had effectively, when Mecca surrendered to Muhammad after the wars were over, that they had become Muslims, but he wanted to keep them on side, and he used to distribute Zakat funds to them. So we have his practice, and his practice is fully harmonized with the text of the Quran. And the Caliph Umar decided that that was no longer necessary. Circumstances had changed. Islam was totally securely established in Arabia. These people were not poor, they were not in need in any other way. So he decided that they would no longer receive Zakat funds. And that is something that I learned as a result of reading a book called Islamic Law, or Sharia Law, by a South African scholar called Michael Mamiza. And again, there's a review of that book on my website. So, as far as I'm concerned, what you do is capable of change depending upon the circumstances of the time. The second source of Islam is something called Hadith. It's an Arabic word. And Hadith are people's accounts of what the Prophet Muhammad used to do and what he used to say. So both can be a category of Hadith. If Muhammad used to behave in a particular way and people have a recollection of that, that can be a Hadith. If he said something, that can be a Hadith. And there were the observers, and then the people collected Hadith, and there are 6 big Hadith collections which I'm going to list out for you in a moment. But let me give you a bit more background. The Prophet himself used to discourage people from writing down his ordinary statements. He was very keen that when he gave them bits of the Quran, that they should remember that, they should memorize it, they should write it down if they could write. But he didn't want his own sayings written down, because he didn't want what he said confused with the text of the Quran. Because he was a man, and his sayings were the sayings of a man, whereas the Quran came from God. So he discouraged people from writing down his statements. And these hadith were collected long after the Prophet's time. And of course, there weren't people around at that time who could say what the Prophet had said. It was second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand sometimes. So scholars actually not only wanted to record what was said, but how did that information come to you? So if I'm a hadith collector and person A says to me, I heard from person B, and person B told me that they got it from person C, that the Prophet used to say something. In the hadith collections, not only is the text recorded, but that chain is recorded as well. And Muslim scholars have put enormous effort into looking at those chains. So if you're given a chain that A got it from B, got it from C, the first thing you do is you check, were A and B alive at the same time or not? If they were not alive at the same time, you know that chain is not reliable. If they were alive at the same time, but one lived 500 miles away from somebody else, it's probably not reliable. So there's an enormous amount of scholarship has actually gone into recording, documenting and analysing these chains, which are called isnads. And the strongest recorded hadith, and also looking at the character of these people. Was C known to be well-behaved, badly behaved? Was C regarded as a liar? All of those kinds of things matter as well. And the real hadith scholars, there are massive libraries of material about this stuff. And the strongest hadiths have multiple chains of transmission with transmitters that are known to be reliable. Other hadith have very solitary chains or weak chains, so there's a gradation. And all scholars recognize that some hadith are more reliable than others. Unfortunately, one of the bad habits that some scholars seem to have is that when they're teaching, Islam doesn't have a formal laity because we don't have a formal priesthood, but when they're teaching younger people about religion, they tend to tell them that all hadith are totally reliable. And as an example, I once had a Muslim, very senior Muslim, member of the House of Lords, male, not Lord Sheikh, and I'm not going to play any guessing games about this person's identity, and he said to me, and I have a witness because my wife was there, he said to me that to disbelieve in the reliability of a single hadith, and there are thousands of hadith in the collections, to disbelieve a single hadith is to commit an act of disbelief that causes you to stop being a Muslim. You're now outside Islam, and ISIS are entitled to kill you, etc. That's completely bonkers, of course, but you don't want to get into an argument with him. But he said that because he's been taught that. And I think it's monstrous sometimes what gets taught to sort of naive young people in the name of religious instruction. And I've listed out the main hadith collections, of which the top two are the ones that have the highest status. But the key, and I've listed the dates of birth and death of the hadith collectors, and I've listed them using the Islamic calendar because it's easier to understand this way. The Islamic calendar starts in 622 AD, which is the year that Muhammad moved from Mecca, where his life was in danger, to Medina, where the citizens of Medina had invited him to come, where he would be safe, and actually to rule over them. So these people were born 200 years or more after that date, and were doing their work 250 years after that date. So there was an enormous amount of oral chains that they were collecting. And they did a really sincere job. I mean, Bukhari was faced with hundreds of thousands of hadith and reduced it to a collection of about 8,000 that he considered reliable, and he documented his work and all the chains of transmission, and same with the others. But the idea that they got it 100% right, that there isn't a single hadith in any of these collections that is wrong, is bonkers, especially because some of the hadith contradict each other. And when you're trying to interpret hadith, the first question is, of course, is the hadith reliable itself? And as I said, most of the work by the scholars concentrated on the isnad, the chain of transmission. And in one sense that's logical, because if you're given a statement which said that the Prophet said this, to simply decide that he couldn't possibly have said that based upon the text is a very bold thing to do. Because the whole purpose of collecting these hadith is to find out what he did say. However, in certain cases, I think, and there's a book I'm going to mention in the bibliography, you do have to really look hard at the text, and the text itself will disqualify this hadith from being reliable. Once you've got a hadith where you're reasonably confident about its reliability, then from my perspective is you need to ask, what were the circumstances? What did the Prophet intend when he said it? Even once you're happy that you've got a verbatim record of what he said, what did he mean? What were the circumstances? What was the problem that he was trying to deal with? Just like any lawyer would deal with a judge's judgment. You wouldn't take two sentences out of a judgment and try to apply that without any of the rest of the context. And then finally, from my perspective, what do we draw from that today? Because circumstances change. One of the scholars that I'm going to name later on, because I've got a list of famous scholars, is a guy called Shafi. And Shafi moved from Iraq to Egypt at one stage in his life. And he gave different judgments in Egypt than he'd given in Iraq. And his reason for that was that the circumstances were different. Egypt was a different place with a different culture, different traditions than Iraq. So even though he was a Muslim in both places, he was giving, in certain cases, different decisions. One of the most important questions is whether something in a hadith can abrogate something in the Quran. Abrogation basically means replace. And if I give you an example of somewhere where almost all Muslims there are arguments amongst Muslims about how much abrogation has happened with the Quran, whether anything has ever been abrogated or whether lots of it have been abrogated. I tend to be towards the limited abrogation end of the spectrum. But the rulings on alcohol are quite clear. There are 3 different rulings in the Quran on alcohol, revealed at different times, and each was more strict than the other, ending up with a complete ban. And that is a clear case, as far as I'm concerned, of abrogation. Now the question is whether a hadith from Muhammad can abrogate something that was in the Quran, can effectively cancel the verse of the Quran and replace it with a different thing that you do as a consequence of what's in the hadith. And Kamali, who is a modern day Islamic scholar, a very good chap, I actually met him when I visited Malaysia, and there's a picture of the two of us together on my website along with a review of his book, which I'm going to mention in the bibliography. He says that the majority view of scholars is that very reliable hadith can abrogate the Quran. But he also mentions that Shafi and Ibn Hanbal, who were 2 of the 4 sort of premier scholars in the foundational schools of Islam, disagreed. And I personally, although I in no sense claim to be a scholar, disagree as well. I do not believe that you can abrogate the Quran simply on the word of a man, and the Prophet was a man. The Quran is from God. The scholars I've been talking about, the 4 main schools of Sunni Islamic law, named after these chaps. I'm not going to go into the details about these schools of law, but they predominate in different parts of the world now. So the Hanbali school, founded by Ibn Hanbal, you find heavily in Saudi Arabia, for example. The Shafi school is found heavily in Malaysia. And there are many scholars since then, but all scholars are scholars. They're putting forward an opinion. It's up to you whether you accept or reject that opinion. Now, moving on to religious freedom and what I believe. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, Article 18. And it's very simple, that is what I believe. Everybody has a right to change their religion, they have a right to practice their religion, and cannot be coerced. The key point in this presentation is that I'm going to show how I derive that from Islam itself. There's not a contradiction between being a Muslim and the Universal Declaration. The two are completely consistent. Just as an aside, I don't know if many people have heard of the OIC declaration, the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam. The OIC, now called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, it used to be called the Organization of the Islamic Conference, but they decided that's not a great name. It's 57 member states, mostly Muslim majority, but not all. Some have large Muslim populations without having a Muslim majority. And this was a declaration from the OIC to OIC member states about human rights. And there's a lot of stuff in there about economic rights, but all rights are subject to the Islamic Sharia, because this is Muslims talking to Muslims. And the nearest you get to anything about freedom of religion is Article 10. But when you read Article 10, you realise there's nothing in there about freedom of religion. It's simply saying it's not good to get people to change their religion if they're starving, by offering them food and things like that. And personally, I regard this as not a very satisfactory document. It certainly doesn't have the crystal clarity of the Universal Declaration. And of course, many Muslim majority countries have a fundamental problem with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because they try to hang you if you want to stop being a Muslim. So I've described this section as belief components. I'm going to talk about individual bits of religious belief, and you'll see that they coalesce to form a sort of pattern which allows me to be completely supportive of the Universal Declaration. And the first one, and in many ways the most important, is that God could compel everybody to believe. And God is all-powerful, all-knowing. He could, if he wanted to, compel everybody to believe in one religion. That's obvious if you believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing God. And he has chosen not to do that. We know he's chosen not to do that because there are multiple religions around. And if he hasn't done that, nobody else has the right to try doing that instead. And the Quran itself makes that crystal clear. 10:99 to 100. This is a verse from the Quran. In many places in the Quran, the actual way that it's written is that it's God addressing Muhammad. So, had God willed it, everybody could have become a Muslim, and he didn't. So can you, the Prophet, compel them to believe? Clearly, no. Belief, wanting to believe, comes from God. The second one, consistent with that, is 2.62, which I've often referred to when presenting. Heaven, as far as the Quran is concerned, is not reserved exclusively for Muslims. Jews, Christians and Sabaeans are a sort of long-lost sort of religious group now, provided you believe in God, provided you believe in the Day of Judgment, provided you do righteous deeds, have the reward of the Sustainer. Islam is not an exclusivist religion, although many people try to make it that way. There's an article on my website, Teaching Muslims Religious Intolerance, which it showed about how shocked I was when I found a different Quran translation which put this verse into the past tense, where of course it has completely different implications. God is the religious arbiter, and different groups of people have been given different religions by God, and Muhammad is told not to get into religious arguments with people, that God himself is the ultimate arbiter. And as long as people are following those religions and they don't involve anything other than monotheism, then just leave them to carry on. Individual responsibility. This phrase, no bearer of burdens will bear another's burden, it occurs several times in the Quran. It's normally referred to by the Muslims actually as no soul shall bear the burden of another soul. Each of us is individually responsible. There's no concept of original sin in Islam, the idea that all humanity is born in sin because of the actions of Adam and Eve, which is a Roman Catholic doctrine. And all that Muhammad can do is to warn people. Thou art nothing but a warner. Apostasy is between you and God does not like apostasy. If you abandon your religion, if you deny the truth instead of believing it, you've gone on to the wrong path. It's a sin. And if you abandon your faith and die in that situation, then everything you've done is basically wasted. in the afterlife you're liable to be punished. Even in this world, what you do is liable to fail. It is a fundamental sin. But if you look through the Quran for a penalty for apostasy applied in this life by other people, you won't find it. It's just not there. God does not prescribe any penalty to be administered to people who leave the religion. There are people who argue that there is a penalty. I mean, 5.33 is often quoted, and in the article on apostasy on my website, I link to a book by a chap called Maududi, who was the founder of the Jamaat-e-Islam in the Indian subcontinent, who wrote a whole book on apostasy, and he's really keen on killing people who apostatize, and he refers to this verse. And there are various punishments listed here, apparently, being slain, being crucified, having your hands and feet cut off, or being banished, and Maududi puts them forward as 4 alternative ways of dealing with apostates. But this verse is directed at people who are making war on God and his prophet, not on people who are saying, I don't believe this stuff anymore, I'm leaving. That is not making war. There are hadith, however, which do prescribe human penalties for apostasy. I've quoted one of them here. This is people saying that the Prophet Muhammad said, whoever changes religion, kill him. Another one. And the question is, how reliable are these hadith? The hadith scholars say that they are not reliable enough for religious rulings. I mean, people like Muhammad Hashim Kamali, who's an expert on hadith, this is not me saying it, there's a level of quality that you need in a hadith before you're going to use it for judicial purposes, and these hadith do not meet that level of reliability. And given that they are so contradictory to Islam itself, to what the Quran says rather, I believe that these hadith are not reliable. And it's a question of whether people have scrambled simple apostasy with treason and rebellion. If you look at the schools of Islamic law, like the one founded by Shafi, they're all consistent. They all say, if you leave the religion, then you should be killed. But when you look at the circumstances that these scholars are talking about, it's a time when religious groups and states were exactly the same thing. To leave your religion meant effectively going to fight for the other side. And in the same way that we hanged Lord Haw for spreading Nazi propaganda during the Second World War, and if a British soldier defected and wanted to fight for the Germans, if he was caught and taken prisoner, the Germans would become POWs, but the British guy would have been shot for treason. Those were the circumstances. That is not the same as simply abandoning your religion. And the last one, I think this is the last one, is historical contingency, which, the first question, of course, is, does historical contingency exist, given that God has perfect foreknowledge? I mean, I've got a quote here from Matthew, extremely famous quote. Same kind of principles you come across in the Quran, that nothing can happen except by the will of God. However, at the same time, in both the Bible and in the Quran, God says to us, choose the right path and not the wrong path. And if we are puppets with God simply as a puppet master pulling the strings, that wouldn't mean anything. So I do believe that humans have free will, that God has given us free will, which we have to exercise to choose the right thing rather than the wrong. But that means that there is then historical contingency. The prophet was a real human being taking real decisions in real circumstances. And what decisions would have been made, how different would they have been if the circumstances had been different? If the Meccans had never tried oppressing the Muslims, he would never have needed to go to Medina to set up a separate state. The Mormons wouldn't be in Utah but for historical contingency. If the people in New York State had not persecuted Joseph Smith, there would have been no trek westwards. So the question of how much of what you see in a religion today is a function of what's happened in the past, as opposed to absolute timeless things coming from God, is a very difficult level of judgment. And I think the idea of putting yourself in an intellectual straitjacket and saying, just look back at the first couple of years or decades of the time of Islam, and that's what we do today, I find very unsatisfactory. So now to what I said was actually the most useful part of the presentation, which is the bibliography. I've got 3 translations of the Quran here that I want to recommend. The first of these is the one that I strongly recommend for anybody who has no previous familiarity with the Quran, for 2 reasons. First of all, the translation is modern, very fresh. I actually know the man who's done this. He's a professor at SOAS. I meet him regularly. And it's very clear. It's not in quasi King James Version language. This is modern English with lots, and really working hard to be as clear and simple as possible. And also very, very few footnotes. There are maybe 10 explanatory footnotes in the whole text. It's tiny. So you can pick it up, you can start at page 1 and read it and get to the end. And I recommend that as the first one to start with. I use the Muhammad Asad regularly for study purposes. It's available free on the internet. When you're doing slides, it's great because you can cut and paste. And it's a really good quality translation. Muhammad Asad himself was a very interesting guy. He was born in the year 1900 as Leopold Weiss, Polish Jew, converted to Islam at the age of 26. And the Road to Mecca, which is his autobiography of the first 26 years of his life, is a very inspiring book reviewed on my website. The Study Quran is brand new. It came out within the last 6 months. Saeed Hussein Nasser, who is an American, based in America, he's a Shia. There are 4 translators together. 2 of them are actually American converts to Islam. Very high quality, incredibly good quality footnotes. I've got a hard copy in Manchester and a hard copy in London, and I've got it on Kindle. But even from the Kindle, unfortunately, you can't cut and paste, of course. So it's a nuisance when you're trying to do a presentation. I didn't fancy retyping all the text, which is why I use Muhammad Asad. Hadith, this textbook of Hadith studies by Muhammad Hashim Kamali is a standard student textbook for learning about Hadith, how they work, how the systems work, the classification systems. And it's extremely authoritative. He has his own educational institution in Malaysia, paid for by the Malaysian government now. He used for many years to be at the Islamic University in Kuala Lumpur. Totally standard, mainstream, authoritative. This is not Muhammad Amin ultra-liberal talking. This guy is mainstream, and he's influenced me very heavily. This second book is much more recent and is more radical. And this guy is looking much more at the content of the Hadith as it means for judging that. There's a whole section in Bukhari, for example, full of hadiths about predestination, implying that it's basically predestined who goes to hell and who goes to heaven, just like I think Calvinism might be like that. And he points out how contradictory that is to what the Quran says, and therefore those hadith cannot be reliable regardless of what you think of the chain of transmission. On Islam generally, a biography of Muhammad, very inspiring, written by Martin Lings, who was an English convert to Islam. Very, very easy to read. Hans Kung, who's a Roman Catholic theologian, has written a 700-page blockbuster on Islam. Deep historical, deeply grounded. Here is a man who's very religious, but not a Muslim, but is sympathetic. And you learn so much about the history of Islam from reading it. And this book, Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence, shows how Muslims developed Islamic law, the interrelationship between Hadith, the Quran, discussions of abrogation, etc. And as I said, I strongly recommend these books. And with that, I have reached the end.